It begins, as so many unsettling stories do, not with a scream or a crime, but with the soundless turning of a page. Picture an archive in the dim winter of the late 19th century. The air is dry, filled with the smell of dust and old paper. A lone caretaker, tasked with cataloging forgotten volumes, brushes his hand across a stack of weathered bindings. And that is when he finds it, a book without title, without spine lettering, without even the faintest clue of where it came from. No author's name. No printer's stamp. No date. Only words, already waiting. At first glance, it seemed nothing unusual. Europe was littered with anonymous pamphlets and small devotional manuscripts, many of them printed cheaply for churches or societies too minor to be recorded. But as the caretaker opened the first page, something unsettled him immediately. The script was neat, elegant, consistent. Yet there was no preface, no dedication, no table of contents. It simply began, with an event, described as though the reader already knew it. The collapse of a mill on the riverbank, the deaths of 3 men inside, and the exact time the bell of the town's church had rung that night. The caretaker frowned. He had been a boy in this region when that mill had fallen. He remembered his father bringing home word of the accident. And the book described it not only with accuracy, but with an intimacy that was impossible, as though the writer had stood in the room where beams cracked and splinters flew. The screams, the smell of smoke, the way the lanterns fell one by one into the river. None of this had ever been reported in the newspapers. None of it could have been known, unless the writer had been there. Curiosity overcame discomfort. He turned the page. Another account awaited him. A house fire, 1 valley over. A farmer's child suffocating from the smoke before anyone could reach him. The detail was staggering, the sound of coughing described, the way the mother's hands trembled as she beat against a locked door. Again, no author. No hint of a purpose. Just observation, cold and merciless. The caretaker closed the book. He left it on the table, intending to set it aside. Yet as evening fell, he found himself returning to it, drawn by the quiet certainty of its prose. He began reading not as one browses a book, but as one listens to a confession. And with every page, the same realization pressed heavier upon him: this was not a collection of stories. These were records. And worse, they were records of real events. When he showed the book to the archivist, the man grew pale. He recognized the names, the places, the tragedies. Some had occurred decades earlier. Others, disturbingly, were more recent. All had one thing in common: none had ever been the subject of printed histories. They were local incidents, known only to families and communities. There was no possible reason for them to appear in a single volume, unless someone had painstakingly gathered them, compiling lives and deaths into a manuscript of obscure purpose. The archivist locked the book away. But already, whispers had begun. Staff in the building gossiped about its contents. Someone had read aloud a passage describing a drowning, a merchant who slipped into the river after drinking too much, only for another worker to remark that her own uncle had died that way, on that very night, 30 years ago. Coincidence, perhaps. But when more parallels emerged, the whispers turned to fear. Who had written it? A parish priest with too much time on his hands? A grieving widower who chronicled tragedy as a form of penance? Or something else, something not human at all, a hand that could see and record events without ever having been present? The unsettling truth was that no one knew. The book bore no watermarks, no printer's guidelines, no binding style to suggest its origin. Paper analysis placed it somewhere in the middle of the century, but that meant little. Paper was imported widely by then. The ink was black, stable, ordinary. Only the content set it apart. And then came the detail that transformed curiosity into terror. As one reader turned to the back of the book, he found a passage describing an accident, the collapse of a barn roof during a storm. A man crushed beneath the beams. A child who survived, crying out for help. The reader went pale. For that was not an event from the past. It was an event from the night before. How could it be? The ink was dry, the letters crisp. There was no sign that anyone had handled the book recently. Yet here it was, describing what had just taken place. This discovery spread like wildfire. No one could agree on what it meant, but everyone sensed that it was wrong. Books were supposed to record, not anticipate. Yet this one seemed to bend the boundary, describing the past as though it had already been remembered, and the present as though it had already been concluded. The caretaker who had first found it refused to touch it again. He told colleagues that when he closed his eyes, he could still see the words, stark and perfect, written across his mind as though he himself were one of the characters being observed. Others claimed the same. The book did not read like a story. It read like surveillance, and the reader was never outside its gaze. Eventually, the book was placed under lock and key. But by then, it was too late. Copies of its passages had already circulated. People repeated them in taverns and whispered them at church doors. Soon, it was not only the existence of the book that disturbed the town, but the idea that anyone might be mentioned within it. For if it could describe past tragedies with flawless detail, and present ones as though they had already passed, what would happen when it began to describe what had not yet occurred? In that question lies the seed of the terror that would grip the town for generations. A book without an author, without a publisher, without even a name, and yet with the power to write the lives of others into permanence, as if they had no choice but to live what was already written. And it all began with the first page that should never have existed. To understand the unease this book caused, one must first understand the place where it appeared. The town was small, set among rolling hills and damp fields, a settlement more concerned with crops, seasons, and sermons than with anything resembling scholarship. In the mid-19th century, towns like this rarely made their mark on maps. They were passed through, not visited. Life there was simple, repetitive, and bound by traditions so old that no one could remember their beginnings. At its center stood a church of gray stone, its bell tower the only structure visible for miles around. Every morning and evening, the bells tolled, announcing both the rhythm of prayer and the slow passage of time. The streets were little more than dirt tracks, worn down by hooves and cartwheels. Children played in the mud. Women hauled water from the well. Men worked fields by hand, returning home weary before the dim light of oil lamps. What the town did not have was a printer. No press. No machines. Not even a workshop capable of producing the most modest of books. Literacy itself was a rarity. A handful of households owned Bibles, often passed down for generations, their pages yellowed and their bindings fragile. Letters, if they arrived at all, came from distant cities and were read aloud by priests or schoolteachers. Knowledge was something that came from beyond, brought by travelers or merchants, not something cultivated within. And so the sudden appearance of a bound volume, anonymous, pristine, and filled with descriptions of local events, was not merely strange. It was impossible. No villager could have produced it. No printer existed for miles. The very existence of the book violated the natural order of the town's reality. It was as though an artifact from a larger world, or perhaps from no world at all, had been dropped without explanation into their midst. The people of the town were not inclined toward abstract thinking. They explained most misfortunes through the language of faith and superstition. A failed harvest was punishment for unconfessed sin. A fever was either the will of God or the work of a hidden curse. When the book emerged, their minds instinctively sought similar categories. Was it holy, a new scripture revealing the will of heaven? Or was it profane, the snare of the devil himself? That tension was felt most strongly by the clergy. The parish priest, a man both respected and feared, warned that the book was a temptation. He reminded his flock that scripture alone was sufficient, and that to seek knowledge beyond it was to invite corruption. Yet even he could not deny that the accounts within the book were precise. Too precise. When asked how such detail could exist without divine authorship, he offered no reply. His silence only deepened the mystery. Meanwhile, those few who could read took it upon themselves to study the text. They were schoolmasters, retired soldiers, and widows whose sons had taught them their letters. By candlelight, they bent over the book and found themselves staring into something uncanny. Every incident described had roots in their own memory. A bridge collapse they had heard about as children. A family whose house had been consumed by fire. A sudden illness that claimed a beloved midwife. All of it recorded without error, and all of it written in a voice that was neither compassionate nor cruel, but merely observing. This detached tone unsettled them most. It felt clinical, as if the writer, if such a writer even existed, cared nothing for the lives involved, nothing for the grief of survivors. There were no morals drawn, no lessons offered, no consolations of faith. Only raw events, stripped bare of sentiment. To a people accustomed to understanding life through parables and sermons, such writing felt less like human record and more like judgment. Soon, the town was alive with whispers. Farmers at the well spoke of the book as though it had always been there, waiting to be discovered. Housewives speculated that it had been left behind by travelers, though none could say when. The oldest residents insisted that no such volume had existed in their youth. Yet the most troubling suggestion came from those who wondered aloud if the book had not been written, printed, or bound by any human hand at all, but rather had appeared, complete, as though it had always existed outside of time. Against this background of rumor, tension rose. The priest doubled down on his warnings, declaring the book a blasphemy. But others, more curious than cautious, argued that it might be a gift, a means of recording truths before they were forgotten. Some even wondered whether it was a mirror of their own lives, and whether their names too would eventually appear in its pages. And here lies the most disturbing fact. In a town so small, every tragedy described in the book had left scars on someone present. The mill collapse, the drowning, the house fire, these were not distant tales, but the lived grief of mothers, fathers, and children. To read the book was not to study history. It was to reopen wounds. Each entry felt like a ghost, called back into the room. Families who had buried their sorrows were forced to face them anew, described with cruel precision on paper that no one claimed to have written. By the end of that year, the book had divided the town. Half the population refused to let it be mentioned. They turned away from those who read it, whispering of curses and damnation. The other half treated it like a relic, consulting it in secret and passing fragments of copied text to trusted neighbors. Whether feared or revered, the volume became the town's dark center, an uninvited guest around which every conversation circled. And always the same question returned: how could a town with no printer, no publishing house, and barely a dozen literate citizens have become the resting place for such a book? It was not only a question of origins, but of intrusion, as though something beyond comprehension had reached into their lives and left behind evidence that it had been watching all along. In time, the question itself would prove more dangerous than any answer. For the book did not remain a curiosity. It would soon become something far worse, a mirror not only of the past, but of the future. The book might have remained a curiosity, locked away in the archive, if not for the restless curiosity of a few men and women who could not ignore its pull. In towns such as this, readers were scarce. But they existed. And when the whispers of the book's strange detail reached their ears, they asked to see it for themselves. The first to be granted that chance was the parish schoolteacher. He was a man in his late 30s, lean, with spectacles perched constantly on his nose. Known for being methodical, he carried the kind of stern patience that one acquires when instructing children who would rather be anywhere but inside a classroom. For him, the book was not merely a mystery but a challenge. He believed in reason, in structure, in explanation. Surely there was some logic here. A hidden author. A forgotten chronicler. Something he could trace and perhaps take credit for identifying. Late one evening, with the archivist's reluctant permission, he sat in the dim light of an oil lamp and began to read. The book's handwriting struck him first. Flawless, unwavering, identical from the first page to the last. It bore no signs of fatigue, no corrections, no smudges. He thought of how even the most skilled scribes allowed for variations, yet this hand appeared inhumanly precise. Still, he pressed on. The more he read, the less he breathed. Here was the account of a drowning. The name of the man matched one he had heard spoken of in his own boyhood, a farmer who vanished during a storm. He remembered the hushed talk in town when the body was found days later. The book described the moment of the fall into the water, the frantic thrashing, the last air bubbling to the surface. But no living witness had ever seen that. The farmer had been alone. How then could the author know? The teacher set the book aside that night and walked home disturbed. Yet the next day, he returned. He told himself it was only for scholarly interest, but already the book was working upon him. His second reading introduced him to an account of an illness that swept through 3 households, sparing none of the elderly. He remembered hearing about it. His own grandmother had died in that outbreak. And here it was, in chilling detail, with the grandmother's house described down to the layout of its rooms. It was then he began to suspect something darker. The book did not simply record. It intruded. It reached into memory, into places private and personal, and exposed them without hesitation. Word spread quickly of his readings, and others asked for their turn. The parish priest, though wary, agreed to glance at its pages. His face, stern and immovable, betrayed a flicker of something rare, fear. He closed the book after only a few passages and refused to read aloud in the company of others. He declared it the work of deception and warned that further contact would invite corruption of the soul. But his warning, rather than deterring, only deepened the desire of others to see it. Soon, the book passed into the hands of a widowed seamstress. She was illiterate herself, but she persuaded the schoolteacher to read aloud. When he did, she gasped, for the account told of a house fire that had claimed her husband years earlier. It described details she had never spoken, the way the fire spread through the roof beams, the way he had broken a window in a futile attempt to escape. Tears welled in her eyes. To her, this was not evidence of deception. It was proof of presence. Someone, or something, had been there, watching, when she thought herself utterly alone. The book's reputation grew in this fashion, through personal recognition. Each reader seemed to find in its pages a reflection of some loss, some wound, some event buried in the soil of memory. For those who had not yet read, the anticipation was unbearable. People began to whisper, would I be in the book too? And inevitably, some were. One man, a blacksmith, insisted on hearing his family name spoken. When it appeared in the account of a carriage accident decades earlier, he turned pale. The victim had been his father, crushed beneath a wheel. The passage was merciless in its description, and the blacksmith left the reading chamber without a word, his eyes hollow. The reactions varied. Some saw the book as a form of witness, a scripture that proved no deed went unseen. Others saw it as an intrusion, a theft of privacy, as though their grief had been taken and pinned to paper without permission. But whether revered or despised, the book was never forgotten. The schoolteacher kept returning to it. His notes became more elaborate. He began charting the names, matching them to records, assembling a map of tragedy across the region. His colleagues noticed his growing pallor, his distracted eyes. He seemed less concerned with teaching his students and more with unraveling the logic of the manuscript. It was said that at night, his lamp burned until dawn, the book open before him, his pen scratching furiously across the margins of his notebooks. There was a pattern, he believed. Not only of what had been written, but of what might be. For each entry appeared in chronological order. A death in 1810, another in 1824, another in 1832. The sequence continued, unbroken, until it reached events only months past. And then, blank pages. Waiting. When he spoke of this discovery, the town shuddered. If the book followed time faithfully, then perhaps the blank pages were not empty at all. Perhaps they were reserved. Reserved for what was still to come. And so the whispers changed. No longer was it simply a record of grief. Now it was seen as a mirror of destiny. Some avoided it altogether, fearing to hear their name or the name of a loved one. Others grew reckless, demanding to know their fate, desperate to learn whether the ink had already sealed their end. The first readers had opened the book seeking curiosity, but what they uncovered was far worse. They had turned it from an artifact into an oracle. And once that shift occurred, the town's innocence was lost. From then on, every tragedy was no longer a shock. It was confirmation. Every accident, every death, was examined against the pages. And each time, the book proved correct. For the people of that small town, life itself began to feel less like a gift and more like a script. A script already written, already waiting, in a hand no one had ever seen. The church had always been the anchor of the town. Its bells marked the hours, its sermons marked the weeks, and its rituals marked the years. When the crops failed, when children sickened, when storms destroyed the fields, the people turned to its doors for solace. But the book did not belong to the church. It obeyed none of its rules, respected none of its teachings, and carried none of its familiar blessings. That alone made it dangerous. From the pulpit, the parish priest spoke with growing severity. "It is not the voice of God," he declared. "It is a temptation, a lure set before us to draw our souls away from salvation." He insisted that those who read its pages were placing themselves in peril, for the devil, he said, could imitate knowledge as easily as he could imitate light. The more detailed the book seemed, the more certain it must be that it was deception. Yet even as he spoke, doubt spread. His refusal to explain how the book could know so much, how it could record details never uttered aloud, was noticed. If it were mere invention, how did it capture the sound of voices crying out, the color of a drowning man's coat, the exact toll of the bell at the hour of death? Silence was a poor defense, and the silence of the church only deepened suspicion. In homes and taverns, people whispered against their priest. They wondered aloud if he truly feared the book for their sake, or if he feared it because it undermined him. For centuries, the church had been the sole interpreter of divine will. But here was a text that spoke without priests, without clergy, without Latin or liturgy. It needed no sermons to clarify it. It told truths plainly, relentlessly, and with an authority that rivaled the pulpit. Small gatherings began to form in secret. Families lit candles in barns and attics, passing around copied fragments of the book. They read aloud to one another, searching for names, for places, for signs that their own lives were written. The act itself was transgressive, for they knew they were defying the priest's warning. But transgression gave the words more power. Reading them felt like trespassing into forbidden knowledge, like lifting a veil that the church had always insisted must remain closed. Stories soon circulated that the book itself had begun to change. Some said that passages grew darker in the night, as though the ink deepened of its own accord. Others claimed new lines appeared, curling across the page in letters as precise as the old ones. The archivist denied such things, but the whispers grew. And when whispers are repeated often enough, they become memories. The priest's sermons turned fiery. He warned that those who read the book were in grave danger, not only of damnation but of earthly judgment. He urged them to confess, to renounce it publicly, to burn whatever scraps they had copied. Yet in private, people noticed his hands tremble when the subject was raised. He, too, had read it. He, too, had seen the uncanny precision of its records. And though he denounced it, he could not escape the knowledge that his authority had been shaken. In times of fear, suspicion finds easy targets. Soon, neighbors accused one another of consorting with the devil. A woman who had lost 3 children to illness was whispered to have embraced the book for consolation, bargaining with its words for another child. A farmer was said to have found his name scrawled in the margins, a prophecy, others believed, of his coming death. Whether these stories were true or not mattered little. They spread like rot, corroding trust, isolating families, turning friends into informants. Children, too, heard the whispers. They dared one another to glimpse the book, to sneak into the archive where it was kept. Their games were hushed, guilty, laced with terror. They claimed that those who looked upon the blank pages at the back could hear faint scratching, as though words were still being written, not by hand, but by some invisible pen guided by a will beyond their sight. The church attempted to stamp out such rumors, but its authority faltered with every denial. For the people had seen too much. They had heard their own sorrows repeated aloud from its pages. They had felt the uncanny accuracy pierce them like a cold wind. And when institutions cannot explain what ordinary men and women know to be true, faith begins to crack. This was the turning point. The book was no longer a curiosity. It had become a wedge, driving the community against itself. Some clung to the church, insisting that obedience was the only shield against damnation. Others withdrew, convinced that the church had lost its power, and that the book revealed a higher truth, one that priests feared because it rendered them obsolete. And so the whispers against the church grew louder. They said the priest had burned a page in secret and that the page had returned, untouched by flame, the next morning. They said he had tried to hide the book, yet each time it was found in a different place, as though it moved itself. Whether any of this was real was irrelevant. The more it was spoken, the more it was believed. Faith had always united the town. Now it divided them. And once divided, the community would never again be whole. The book had done what famine, plague, and poverty had failed to do. It had shaken the church's throne of authority. It had made the people look elsewhere for meaning. And in that search, they would find something far darker than belief, the gnawing suspicion that their lives were no longer their own, but already written in a hand they could neither see nor resist. Until this point, the book had been treated as a strange relic of memory, a haunting archive of events long past. Its weight came from recognition, the shock of seeing one's grief recorded in merciless clarity. But then, without warning, the book crossed a line no one had thought possible. It began to describe not only what had been, but what had not yet occurred. It started with a storm. One evening, the schoolteacher pored over the pages and found a new passage, one he was certain had not been there before. It spoke of a night when the skies would crack with thunder and winds would tear across the valley. A barn would collapse. A man would be crushed beneath the beams while a child, trapped beside him, screamed for help that would not arrive in time. The teacher shivered. The handwriting was the same, the ink dry, the words permanent. Yet the date was marked for the following week. At first, he dismissed it as error, a misremembered incident, or perhaps a record copied out of sequence. But when the storm came, and when the barn fell exactly as described, the denial was stripped away. The child survived. The father did not. The event matched the page with uncanny precision. When news spread, the book's reputation shifted forever. It was no longer an archive of what had been. It was a prophecy of what would be. Fear spread quickly, but fear was not the only reaction. Some were horrified. Others were enthralled. If the book could predict disasters, perhaps it could also warn of opportunities. If it could describe deaths, perhaps it could also reveal paths of survival. The book became an oracle, and those desperate enough were willing to risk their souls to read ahead. The schoolteacher himself began to spiral into obsession. He claimed that the text was lengthening, as though new words bled onto the pages during the night. His notes grew frantic. He no longer slept properly, rising at odd hours to check the book for additions. His colleagues avoided him, disturbed by the manic gleam in his eyes. Yet even as he frightened them, he became indispensable. For when villagers wished to know whether calamity lay in their future, it was to him they went. One night, he read aloud a prediction of a drowning in the nearby river. A fisherman's name was written there, alongside the details of a storm that would drag his boat beneath the current. The fisherman, hearing this, refused to go near the water. He locked himself indoors during storms, avoiding the river entirely. But the prophecy did not loosen its grip. Weeks later, on a clear day, the man stumbled while mending nets at the river's edge. He slipped, struck his head, and drowned in water no deeper than his chest. The town recoiled. Resistance, it seemed, did not break the book's hold. Avoidance did not change the outcome. If your name was written, your fate would follow, twisting and reshaping the path of life until it matched the page. The people whispered that the book did not merely describe events. It demanded them. This realization broke something in the town's spirit. Hope drained away. Life began to feel like a series of steps along a path already drawn. Births, marriages, deaths, all seemed to hover on the edge of inevitability. People no longer asked whether the book told truth. Instead, they asked whether they wished to know. For to read ahead was to forfeit the illusion of freedom. Yet curiosity is stronger than fear. Families gathered in barns by candlelight, begging the schoolteacher to read aloud. Mothers wanted to know if their children were safe. Widows wanted to know whether they would find love again. Farmers asked whether their crops would flourish. And each time, the answers were delivered with the same detached precision, the same cold certainty. Sometimes the news was comforting. More often it was not. And when tragedy struck exactly as foretold, even the skeptics fell silent. The priest redoubled his condemnation, declaring that the book was nothing but a snare. But his words no longer carried weight. The people had seen too much. They could not deny what their own eyes and ears confirmed. Scripture promised salvation in eternity. The book offered knowledge in the present. And knowledge, once tasted, could not be abandoned. Some began to act recklessly. If the book decreed that a man would die by fire, he laughed and walked into storms without fear of lightning, knowing it was not his time. If a woman's page promised her a long life, she dared the river, the cliffs, the wolves of the forest, convinced she was untouchable until her written end arrived. Inevitably, this arrogance claimed lives sooner than predicted. But even these deaths only fed the book's legend. For if someone perished before their page was due, the book would be consulted again, and the passage would be gone, as though erased, rewritten to match reality. The archivist himself swore to this, pale and trembling. He claimed he had seen entire lines vanish overnight, replaced by briefer accounts that matched the altered truth. The book, he whispered, was not simply recording or predicting. It was adapting. Writing reality as much as reflecting it. The implications were unbearable. It meant the book was not a passive object but an active force, bending lives toward its ink. It meant that human will was irrelevant, that prayers, choices, and rebellions were swallowed whole by its pages, reconfigured into the one outcome it had already decreed. Some villagers fled. They left behind homes, fields, and kin, unwilling to live in a place where their lives felt scripted. Others clung tighter, unable to leave, bound by fascination or despair. They feared that even if they ran, the book would continue to write them, its reach stretching beyond the valley, beyond the borders of their small world. The town became a place of silence. Families ceased celebrating births with joy, knowing the child's name might one day appear in black ink, followed by a date and a cruel description. Weddings were marked with unease, as though happiness were only a pause before tragedy. And funerals, once solemn but hopeful, became unbearable confirmations of the book's power. Each death was no longer a mystery of God. It was the echo of a sentence already written. In this suffocating atmosphere, the people began to ask questions they had never dared before. What if the book did not simply know their fates? What if it created them? What if their lives, their loves, their tragedies, were not unfolding by chance or providence, but by the silent command of a manuscript that had no author? It was no longer enough to call it prophecy. It was something else, something worse. A voice without a mouth. A hand without a body. A will without mercy. And with each new prediction, the people realized that they were not merely readers of the book. They were its characters. The teacher had been the book's most faithful reader, its reluctant interpreter, its chosen mouthpiece. But when the pages began turning toward him, his resolve cracked. For months he had guided others, warning them, comforting them, cursing the burden he carried. But he had never truly believed that the book would mark him. He thought himself an observer, not a participant. He was wrong. It began with whispers in the margins. Lines faint and half-formed, smudged as though the ink had hesitated. They seemed to describe a man alone, standing in the schoolhouse doorway, staring into the night. The words did not give a name, but the description was unmistakable. The teacher's hands shook as he traced the letters. He closed the book, locked it away, and swore he would not open it again. But he could not resist. The following week, he returned to the pages. The handwriting was clearer now, firmer. It spoke of absence. Of a man vanishing without violence, without farewell. It described desks left in disarray, lessons unfinished, papers scattered like leaves. No blood, no body. Only emptiness. The teacher stopped sleeping. His colleagues noticed the change. His voice grew thin, his eyes ringed with shadow. He lectured less, lost track of dates, forgot the names of his pupils. He carried the book everywhere, clutching it as though separation would hasten the prophecy. At times, he insisted it was trying to speak directly to him, that the letters shimmered or rearranged themselves when he blinked. The children avoided him. The adults pitied him. But no one dared take the book away. Then came the night of his final vigil. Witnesses claimed they saw him pacing the schoolhouse long after the candles should have burned out. Some said they heard him reading aloud, his voice low and frantic, as if arguing with the text. Others swore they heard no voice at all, only the turning of pages in the dark. By morning, he was gone. The schoolhouse door stood open, the hinges creaking in the wind. Inside, his belongings remained, coat on the chair, spectacles on the desk, inkpot still half full. The book lay at the center, its covers closed. The only thing missing was the man himself. Search parties scoured the countryside. They dragged the river, combed the woods, questioned travelers. No trace was found. Not a footprint, not a scrap of cloth. It was as though he had stepped out of the world entirely. When the book was opened again, the new passage awaited them. It was brief, brutally concise. The teacher no longer teaches. His voice is no longer heard. He is elsewhere, as the page required. No date. No body. No explanation. Only finality. The town fractured in its response. Some mourned him, certain that he had been consumed by the curse he carried. Others whispered that he had been taken, pulled into the book's realm to join the names it recorded. Still others insisted he had fled, abandoning them to save himself, though none could explain why he would leave so suddenly, with no provisions and no destination. The priest declared it judgment. He preached that the teacher's pride had led him astray, that by placing trust in the book instead of scripture, he had doomed himself. A handful believed him. Most did not. The teacher had not been proud, only terrified. His disappearance felt less like punishment and more like erasure, as if the book had tired of his service and written him out. Life in the town grew darker. The absence of the teacher left a silence that could not be filled. Without him, no one dared read the book aloud. It remained on the desk in the schoolhouse, untouched, gathering dust. Yet its presence weighed heavier than ever, as though it were listening, waiting. Parents warned children not to go near it, though more than one child admitted sneaking inside to stare at the covers, daring themselves to lift them and failing. The archivist visited once. He claimed that when he touched the leather binding, he felt warmth, a faint, pulsing rhythm, like the beat of a heart. He recoiled and never returned. As months passed, stories multiplied. Some swore they glimpsed the teacher at the edge of the woods, pale and silent, his eyes black as ink. Others claimed to see his silhouette at the schoolhouse window on moonless nights. Each sighting was brief, dissolving when approached. Skeptics dismissed these tales as grief-born fantasies. But the believers whispered that he was not gone at all. He had been absorbed into the book, his body rewritten, his essence turned into script. If this was true, then he had not disappeared. He had been transformed. The fear deepened. For if the book could consume a man so thoroughly that only shadows of him remained, what did it mean for those whose names were yet to appear? Were they too destined not merely for death, but for absorption, their lives reduced to a few cruel lines, their existence preserved only as ink? The book no longer needed to be opened. Its power radiated through its silence. It had shown them that resistance was futile. It had shown them that service brought no mercy. And it had shown them that disappearance could be as final, and as terrifying, as death. The schoolhouse was eventually abandoned. Parents refused to send their children, fearing the influence of the place. The desks rotted, the roof sagged, but the book remained, untouched on its desk, as though nailed to the spot by unseen hands. Travelers who passed through the valley sometimes asked why the old building stood empty. The townspeople only shook their heads and said little. But in private, they warned one another, do not enter. Do not look inside. Do not touch what does not belong to you. Yet the silence did not heal. The memory of the teacher lingered like a ghost. His absence was louder than his presence had ever been. And though the townspeople avoided the schoolhouse, they could not avoid the truth it represented. The book had claimed its first servant. It would not be the last. For the teacher's disappearance was not an ending. It was a demonstration. A reminder that anyone, no matter how cautious, could be unmade when the page decided it was time. And somewhere in the valley, in homes where shutters rattled in the wind and candles burned low, the people whispered the question they dared not speak aloud: if the book could take the teacher, who would it take next? For years, the townspeople whispered about the book, but none dared touch it. They avoided the schoolhouse, crossed the street when they passed its broken windows, and lowered their voices when they spoke of it. It had claimed the teacher, and that alone was warning enough. But fear does not burn forever, it calcifies, hardens into frustration. And frustration, in time, can turn into reckless courage. The idea was not born in daylight but in drink. A gathering of men in the tavern, half drunk and heavy with resentment, began to speak more boldly than usual. The oldest among them slammed his cup down and said what none dared to voice sober: if the book is cursed, then let us curse it back. Let us burn the damn thing. The room fell silent, and then the murmurs began. Burn it, yes. Burn it until no trace remained. Fire had always been humanity's oldest defense against darkness, its cleansing answer to rot, disease, and unholy things. Fire did not fear ink. Fire did not bow to curses. They made their plan in whispers, too ashamed of their fear to speak loudly. They would go at night, when the valley slept. They would bring oil and torches. They would set the schoolhouse ablaze, and with it, the book that had tormented them for years. By dawn, nothing would remain but ash. And perhaps then, finally, their lives would return to silence. The night chosen was moonless. A cold wind carried through the valley, sharp as knives. 5 men gathered outside the tavern and walked toward the schoolhouse. They carried lanterns, bundles of dry wood, and a jug of oil heavy enough to drown a fire. None spoke. Their silence was not solidarity but fear, thick and choking. The schoolhouse stood waiting, skeletal and hollow. The door creaked open without resistance. Inside, the air was colder still, as though the building exhaled frost. Their lanterns illuminated dust and decay, desks warped by damp, chalk crumbling to powder, a blackboard veined with cracks. And at the front, on the teacher's desk, lay the book. It looked smaller than they remembered. Almost ordinary. Its leather binding dulled with age, its corners scuffed, its surface unthreatening. But its stillness was a lie, and all 5 men knew it. They could feel it watching them. The youngest of the group, a farmhand barely grown, stepped forward first. His hands shook as he poured oil across the desk, soaking the book until it dripped with slick, dark trails. The smell filled the room, sharp and nauseating. Another man scattered wood along the floor, while a third raised his torch, the flame wavering like a nervous heartbeat. "Do it," whispered the old man who had spoken first in the tavern. His voice trembled, not from doubt but from urgency. "Before it knows." The torch lowered. Flames caught the oil, racing across the desk in a sudden flare. Fire licked at the book's cover, searing its edges, blackening the leather. The men exhaled, some with relief, others with horror. For a heartbeat, it seemed the plan would work. Fire, pure and ancient, would undo the curse. Then the book opened. Not by hand, not by wind, not by accident. Its covers parted slowly, deliberately, as if invisible fingers pressed them wide. Pages fluttered, not away from the fire but into it, turning themselves one by one. The ink shimmered in the firelight, and the words refused to burn. Instead, the flames recoiled. The men stepped back in terror as the fire bent away from the pages, shrinking, sputtering, retreating. The oil-soaked wood burned, the desk cracked, the walls hissed with smoke, but the book remained untouched, glowing faintly, as though the fire itself bowed to it. The youngest man screamed. He seized his torch and drove it directly into the heart of the book, forcing the flame onto the parchment. The room filled with the smell of charred paper, and for a moment it seemed he had succeeded. But when he lifted the torch, the page beneath was pristine. Not a mark. Not a curl. Not even warmth. Then the words changed. The men saw it together, fresh ink bleeding onto the page, curling across the parchment in real time. Letters forming, steady and merciless. They read the lines aloud without meaning to, the syllables dragging from their throats like chains. 5 men come with fire. 5 men see fire bend. 5 men will carry fire back with them, and fire will not leave. Panic exploded. The youngest dropped his torch and bolted. The others followed, stumbling over one another in their rush to escape. Behind them, the schoolhouse burned, walls collapsing, roof cracking, yet still the book lay untouched, gleaming faintly on its desk as if the inferno belonged to it. By morning, the schoolhouse was nothing but smoldering ruin. Ash filled the air, thick and choking. Charred wood jutted upward like bones. The villagers gathered to see what remained, and when they did, a hush fell over them. The book sat among the ashes, untouched. Not a corner singed. Not a page curled. Its presence was almost obscene, a survivor where nothing else lived. But the curse did not end with failure. That night, the men who had tried to burn it woke to find fire in their homes. Not wild flames, not accidents of lantern or hearth. Small fires, deliberate and contained, appearing on shelves, in cupboards, at the foot of beds. Fires that refused to spread until noticed, then leapt toward anything the men tried to save. One man lost his barn. Another his livestock. The youngest lost his home entirely, reduced to ashes in a single night. Each swore that when they fought the flames, they heard whispers beneath the crackle, as though the fire itself mocked them. The town realized then that the book could not be destroyed by fire. Fire was not its enemy but its servant. What they had thought a weapon had become a punishment, turned back against them. From that day, no one spoke of burning the book again. They knew better. To attack it was to invite its retaliation. To fight it was to lose. The ruins of the schoolhouse remained blackened, a permanent scar at the valley's heart. Children were warned never to play near it. Travelers were told to pass it quickly. Yet the book endured, sitting in its ashes, patient and eternal. Some whispered that the book had proven itself indestructible. Others believed it had proven something worse, that destruction itself was its ally. That no matter how much fire they summoned, it would always belong to the book, never against it. And so the townspeople did what humans have always done when faced with a horror they cannot defeat. They stopped trying. They looked away. They convinced themselves that silence was safety. But in their hearts, they carried the knowledge that silence, too, was only temporary. Because the book had survived the fire. And survival meant it was waiting for something more. The valley carried silence like a wound. After the burning attempt, no one dared speak of the book openly. Its survival had humiliated them, and the fire that followed the 5 men left a lesson written in smoke across the hills. The villagers learned to walk past the ruins with their heads bowed, eyes averted. Some moved away entirely. Others built shrines at the edge of town, not to honor but to plead. Yet, as always, silence was not protection. It was only a delay. The first sign arrived in winter, when the snow made graves shallow. A shepherd, returning home at dusk, saw movement on the hillside cemetery. He thought at first it was children playing, dark shapes darting between the headstones. But as he drew nearer, the shapes did not scatter. They stood. And they were too tall, too still, too silent. The shepherd froze, his lantern shaking. Snow shifted beneath the figures, yet no breath clouded the air. They were not alive. And yet, impossibly, they moved. By morning, whispers spread like frost, the dead had risen. At first, the villagers dismissed it as fear, a trick of half-light. But denial died quickly. Within days, others saw them too, old neighbors, long buried, walking at night without expression. Their skin was pale, stiff, their mouths unmoving. They did not speak, did not cry out, did not claw at the living. They only walked, aimless and endless, as though some invisible string pulled them from earth and set them wandering. The villagers tried not to look. But one truth made avoidance impossible: these figures walked the same paths they had taken in life. The blacksmith's father passed the forge each night, pausing at the door before moving on. A mother who had died in childbirth stood each evening near the cradle of her grandchild, eyes hollow, hands never reaching. The shepherd's own brother, buried 3 years before, crossed the fields in the exact line his sheep once followed. The villagers had asked for silence, and the silence had answered. The dead returned not with screams, not with rotting hunger, but with unbearable familiarity. And yet, the worst was still hidden. One evening, a group of men followed one of the walking dead, the teacher who had first opened the book. His figure drifted from the cemetery, down the road, across the ruins of the schoolhouse, and finally into the woods. He did not stumble. He did not slow. His path was sure, as if guided. The men followed at a distance, careful not to let their lanterns betray them. Deep within the forest, they saw the teacher stop. Before him, on a fallen log, lay the book. Untouched by snow, unmarked by weather, its pages opened as though waiting. The teacher bent, not with struggle but with obedience, and placed his hands on the parchment. His lips moved. Words spilled from him, low and steady, though his eyes were hollow and his face expressionless. The men swore later that the sound was not human speech but something older, sharper, shaped like command. And the book listened. Its pages turned themselves, slowly, deliberately, as if savoring each syllable. The forest seemed to breathe with it, trees creaking though no wind moved, branches shifting as if straining to hear. When the teacher finished, he closed the book, lifted it with stiff, sure hands, and walked deeper into the woods. The men did not follow. They fled. By dawn, the valley knew, the dead were not merely wandering. They were servants. And the book was their master. At first, the dead did nothing more than walk. Their presence was horror enough. Families abandoned homes where they were seen. Children refused to sleep, fearing the sound of footsteps outside their windows. Dogs barked until their voices broke, sensing what their masters would not name. But then came the calling. It began with dreams. Villagers awoke screaming, certain they had heard their names whispered at the edge of sleep. The voices were not strangers. They belonged to their dead, fathers, mothers, brothers, children. The voices called softly, pleadingly, asking to be followed. And some obeyed. A widow was the first. She left her home in the middle of the night, barefoot in the snow. By morning she was found in the cemetery, standing before her husband's grave, her lips blue, her body frozen. The next night, a child followed the voice of her grandmother. She was found in the woods, unharmed but silent, clutching a page torn from the book, though none had dared touch it. The pages spread like infection. Soon, scraps of parchment appeared in barns, kitchens, and doorways. Each bore words in shifting ink, sometimes legible, sometimes twisted. Some villagers swore the words were names, their own names, or the names of their kin. Others claimed they were instructions. And a few admitted, in hushed terror, that when they read them, they felt compelled to obey. The dead no longer needed to walk. They had found their way inside the living. Desperation took root. The villagers turned to the church, but the priest refused to enter the ruins or touch the book. He claimed the curse was older than any prayer, older than scripture itself. "It is not the devil's work," he whispered. "It is something the devil himself would fear." And so, the villagers did what humans always do when reason collapses. They turned on one another. Accusations spread like sparks. This family harbored a page, that man had spoken to his dead mother, this woman was seen walking at night. Fear became its own law, harsher than any curse. Some were cast out into the snow. Others were locked inside their homes and left to starve. Still, the dead returned. It became impossible to tell where the curse ended and grief began. Families who buried their children now found them at the window each night. Wives saw their husbands standing in doorways, eyes blank, waiting. The living could not weep without fear of summoning the dead. Mourning itself became dangerous. Love itself became bait. The valley was rotting not through violence but through memory. The book had learned the most delicate cruelty, to make the dead a weapon, not by claws or hunger, but by recognition. And through it all, the book remained. Always untouched, always unharmed, always waiting. The villagers no longer spoke of destroying it. That dream had burned away. Now they spoke only of endurance, of how long they could live alongside it, pretending not to hear the footsteps, pretending not to see the figures at the edge of the fields. But they knew, all of them knew, that endurance was not survival. Endurance was only delay. The return of the dead was not an ending. It was a beginning. A preparation. A rehearsal for something greater, something still unwritten. The book was not finished. Its pages were still waiting to be filled. And the villagers understood, in their bones, that the ink would not stop with the dead. The valley had learned to live with the dead, or at least to pretend. They no longer screamed at the sight of wandering figures, no longer fainted when they heard footsteps in the night. They closed their shutters, tightened their doors, and told themselves that silence was survival. But silence was never enough. It was only an invitation. The book was changing. It began with the names. At first, they appeared as faint ink stains on scraps of parchment scattered across the village. Some were smudged, others written with unnatural clarity. Always, they were names. At first the names belonged to the dead. Then, disturbingly, they belonged to the living. Men found their names carved into their barn doors. Women found theirs scrawled across their mirrors. Children awoke to see their names written on their hands, in a blackness that no washing could erase until dawn. The villagers tried to burn the scraps, bury them, drown them in wells. It did not matter. The names returned. Some claimed they saw them floating across the surface of the river, words etched in ripples of water that vanished when touched. Others swore they heard them whispered by the wind, syllables curling through their chimneys, too precise to be accident. And then came the figure. At first, only hunters spoke of it, a tall silhouette glimpsed in the forest, neither man nor corpse. It carried no lantern, cast no shadow, but it moved with certainty, as though it knew every root and stone. Some said its face was hidden by a hood. Others claimed it had no face at all. But all agreed on one detail, it carried a book. Not the book. Another. This book was thinner, but heavier somehow. Its pages glowed faintly, not with light but with presence, as though they carried weight beyond paper. The figure held it close, protecting it from sight. Yet, sometimes, hunters swore they saw the pages flutter as if by unseen hands. And when they did, their names appeared upon them. The villagers began to whisper a new title. Not the cursed book, but the one who bore it. They called him the collector of names. No one saw him clearly in daylight. But each night, new names appeared. A boy swore he saw the figure at the edge of his bed, motionless, writing with fingers that left no ink but carved words directly into the wood. A woman claimed the figure stood over her child's cradle, turning pages with slow care as though deciding which name to keep. Soon, fear took on a new shape. It was no longer just the dead returning, no longer footsteps in the snow. It was the knowledge that to be named was to be chosen. And once chosen, there was no undoing. The first victim was the blacksmith. He was found in his workshop at dawn, body rigid, eyes wide, his own name burned across his chest as if seared from within. His mouth was open, frozen mid-breath, yet no cry had been heard. There were no wounds, no signs of struggle. Only the name. And his forge lay cold, though the coals had been alive only hours before. The villagers buried him quickly, too quickly, as if haste might erase the fear. But it did not. That night, the blacksmith walked again. He moved silently, his burned name glowing faintly through his shirt, casting light enough to be seen from the road. The villagers barred their doors, but the truth was unavoidable. Death was no longer the worst fate. To be written was worse. And the collector kept writing. The priest was next. He fought it, clutching his crucifix, reciting prayers until his voice broke. But when dawn came, his body was found kneeling before the altar, his name etched into the stone floor, burned deeper than any tool could cut. His lips were moving, though no breath passed them, repeating words no one could understand. They buried him too. And he walked as well, carrying his crucifix like a lantern, his hollow eyes fixed not on heaven but on the book that waited in the woods. The valley collapsed into terror. No one spoke their names aloud. Mothers forbade children from saying them, even in play. Men no longer carved their names into wood or signed them on contracts. Some went so far as to burn every document, every trace of their identity. To exist nameless, they believed, was the only safety. But names are not so easily erased. Names live in memory, in the mouths of others, in the pages of unseen books. The collector had no need of paper left behind. He carried his own ledger. What the villagers never knew, or perhaps always feared, was that the collector was not a man. Not entirely. Some claimed he was the first teacher, returned from death to serve the book. Others whispered he was older, a thing born alongside the book itself, an author without origin. What mattered was not what he was, but what he wanted. And what he wanted were names. For each name he wrote, another figure rose. For each figure that rose, the valley thinned, hollowed, emptied of life. The walking dead multiplied, not as a mindless horde but as an army in waiting, each bound by their name, each tethered to a word that could not be untied. And yet, there was something worse. One night, a girl followed her mother into the woods. She had seen the collector pass and had watched, trembling, as her mother drifted after him as if summoned. They came to a clearing where the book lay open on a stone. The collector stood over it, faceless, motionless, while the mother knelt. The girl swore her mother spoke her own name aloud, as if offering it, as if giving it freely. The collector wrote it down. And in that moment, the girl saw her mother's body fall lifeless, only to rise again, hollow, bound. The girl ran home screaming, carrying only her mother's voice in her memory. And from that night on, the villagers knew the most terrifying truth of all: it was not always theft. Sometimes it was surrender. Some began to believe the book was no longer forcing names, but inviting them. And those who lived in grief, who longed for their dead, found themselves tempted. To give one's name was to join. To walk forever. To never be left behind. But the price was unbearable, to exist, but not as oneself. To live only as a word. To walk, but without will. To breathe, but without soul. The collector grew bolder. He no longer lingered at the edge of sight. He passed openly through the streets, silent, tall, faceless, carrying the book with reverence. Doors barred themselves, windows shuttered, but his presence was unchallenged. He did not need to break walls. He needed only to write. And the villagers understood at last. This was not punishment. It was harvest. The dead were not accidents of a curse. They were the product of a ledger, a list being filled line by line, soul by soul, name by name. What no one knew, what no one dared imagine, was what happened when the book was full. The collector was not only gathering names. He was preparing them. A library of the dead, catalogued and bound, waiting for the moment the final page was written. And when it was, the valley knew with dread certainty, the dead would no longer walk alone. The valley had grown weary of terror. Fear had become so constant that it no longer screamed, it whispered. The people no longer cried out when they saw the dead. They no longer prayed loudly, no longer begged for mercy. They simply shut their doors, pressed their palms together, and waited for the next name to vanish. It was not life anymore. It was a suspension. But silence, the villagers discovered, was not protection. It was a summons. One evening, as the last light drained from the hills, the church bells rang. No one had pulled the ropes. No one had entered the tower. Yet the bells tolled, slow and deep, vibrating through stone and earth alike. With each chime, windows shattered. With each chime, the doors of homes creaked open against their locks. And with the final chime, the valley fell quiet. It was then that they heard it. Not footsteps. Not whispers. Not the rustle of pages. Nothing. The world was hollow, stripped of every sound. Dogs did not bark. Babies did not cry. The wind itself seemed dead, stilled in its path. The silence was so complete it felt physical, like a hand pressed against the ears. It was not absence. It was presence. The collector had finished writing. The book was full. Its pages, once blank, now bristled with names that glowed faintly, each one a tether, each one a binding. The villagers had long feared what would happen when the final line was written. They were about to learn. At first, the dead gathered. They came from every field, every barn, every road where they had wandered. They moved without haste, yet with unbroken direction, forming a procession through the valley. They did not moan, did not drag, did not reach. They walked upright, silent, disciplined. Each bore their name upon them, etched in skin, in bone, in the very air around their bodies. The glow of the names illuminated the night like 1,000 pale lanterns. The living watched from their windows, paralyzed. The dead did not touch them. Not yet. But their presence was unbearable. It was not violence that terrified, it was the order, the precision, the inevitability. At the procession's center walked the collector. Taller than all, faceless, carrying the book against his chest. The names upon its pages pulsed in rhythm, as though breathing. Each pulse seemed to draw the villagers' own breaths from their lungs. The book was not only a record. It was a hunger. When the dead reached the church, they stopped. The collector ascended the steps and placed the book upon the altar. The doors of the church swung wide though no hand touched them. Candles lit themselves, one by one, their flames silent. And then the book opened. The pages turned without wind, each one revealing names that shimmered like fireflies. The dead stood motionless, waiting. And then, as though commanded, they knelt. All at once. 1,000 corpses, kneeling in reverence, eyes hollow but fixed on the book. The villagers dared not move, but some could not resist looking. They saw the names shift. Letters melted, reformed, rearranged. No longer individual lines, but sentences, phrases, incantations. The book was writing itself anew, combining the dead into something greater. Each name was no longer a person but a word in a larger language. And that language had power. The ground quaked. The walls of the church groaned. The river outside froze mid-flow, water suspended like glass. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. And then came the sound. Not a scream. Not a song. A single tone, resonant and unbroken, rising from the book as though the names themselves had become an instrument. It was not heard with the ears but felt in the bones. The villagers fell to their knees, clutching their heads, not from pain but from recognition. The sound was not noise. It was speech. The book was speaking. What it said could not be translated, for it was not language as humans knew it. It was the sound of every name spoken at once, layered and endless, the identity of a valley condensed into a single utterance. And in that utterance was command. The dead rose again, not as wanderers, not as husks, but as one. Their movements were no longer clumsy, no longer hesitant. They moved with unity, as though a single will guided them. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their names shone brighter than before. They were no longer individuals. They were a chorus. The villagers realized too late, the book had never been collecting. It had been composing. And the composition was finished. The collector lifted the book once more. Though faceless, he seemed to look upon the valley with judgment. The dead turned with him, a legion awaiting release. For a moment, there was stillness, a silence so profound it seemed to stretch into eternity. Then the first villager spoke. He did not mean to. His lips moved against his will, his throat vibrating with words that were not his own. He spoke his name aloud. The sound was swallowed instantly, pulled into the air, inscribed upon nothingness. His body went rigid, then fell limp, rising again with hollow eyes, joining the legion. Another followed. Then another. Soon voices spilled across the valley, each villager speaking their own name unwillingly, compelled by the resonance. One by one, they collapsed and rose again, bound to the book. Resistance was impossible. To have a name was to be claimed. Within hours, the valley was silent again. Utterly. No heartbeat, no breath, no human voice. Only the faint glow of names written in the dark. The collector stood at the altar, book in hand, surrounded by a legion no longer living, no longer dead. They were written. They were words, assembled and complete. The valley had become a sentence. And then, without ceremony, the collector closed the book. The sound was final, louder than thunder, though it made no noise at all. The silence deepened until it seemed the world itself had ended. Birds did not stir. Trees did not sway. Even time seemed hesitant to continue. The collector turned and walked into the night. The legion followed. They did not scatter. They did not wander. They moved as one body, one thought, one story. And as they left, the valley was left behind, empty. Not ruined. Not burned. Simply erased of presence. A place where silence itself had weight. Days later, travelers passed through the valley. They found no bodies, no voices, no signs of life. The fields lay unharvested, the river unmoving, the houses intact but cold. Only the church remained lit, a faint glow leaking through its windows, though no fire burned inside. On the altar lay a single scrap of parchment, blank but for one sentence: every name is a story, and every story must be told. No one could say where the collector had gone. Some claimed he walked toward the mountains. Others swore they saw the legion cross the river without rippling its surface. A few believed he carried the book into the sea, where the names would sink forever. But most feared the truth, that the collector did not stop. That he moved from village to village, valley to valley, gathering names until the world itself was written into silence. For the book was never full. It was only turning its first chapter. And somewhere, in the hush between heartbeats, if one listens closely, the silence is not empty. It is waiting.